Yo, what is up guys, and welcome to another Honkai Star Rail video. Alright, so it's time for another should you pull or skip video. And the limited 5-star character that is featured in today's video will be LUOCHA of the Imaginary Element, who follows the Path of Abundance. In this video, I will briefly be going over the rate up 4 stars available on LUOCHA's banner. After that, I'll be going over LUOCHA's kit, as well as providing his pros and cons. And then finally, I will be providing you guys with reasons why you should consider pulling for LUOCHA and reasons why you should consider skipping him. For a final note, I'd like to state a disclaimer that your decision on whether you should pull or skip LUOCHA is completely up to you. The information that I provide you in this video, as well as my suggestions, should only be used as references towards your decision. Okay, let's begin. Alright, so the rate up 4 stars available in LUOCHA's banner will be Qingque, Pela, and Yukong. I already went over and discussed Pela and Qingque's skills and eidolons in my Silver Wolf vs LUOCHA video, so if you guys are interested in their kit, please check out that video. I'll have the link in the description below. Long story short, Pela is a great supporting character that is able to remove buffs and shred the enemy's defense. Her eidolons overall are mediocre and not really worth pulling for. Qingque is a RNG based sub DPS that receives a power spike at her eidolon 4 and becomes cracked at her eidolon 6. As for Yukong, I'll be going over her skills, major traces, and eidolons because she's a new character and I'm sure most of you guys will be interested in her kit. Okay, one thing before I begin. Keep in mind that we are technically supposed to be getting a free Yukong in patch 1.2, so unless you want her eidolons or you need LUOCHA as your second healer, I'd suggest you holding off on pulling on this banner. Her basic attack just deals single target imaginary damage. For her skill, obtains 2 stacks of Roaring Bowstrings to a maximum of 2 stacks. When Roaring Bowstrings is active, the attack of all allies increases by a certain percentage, and every time an ally's turn ends, Yukong loses 1 stack of Roaring Bowstrings. When it's the turn where Yukong gains Roaring Bowstrings by using her skill, Roaring Bowstrings will not be removed. Okay, good. That was one of the main concerns I had about Yukong before her release, and that concern was if she consumed one of her Roaring Bowstring stacks on the turn she used her skill. So thankfully they cleared that up. Also worth noting that casting ultimates won't consume Roaring Bowstring stacks, so make sure you guys try to weave in those ultimates while Yukong's Roaring Bowstring stacks are active. And for her ultimate, if Roaring Bowstrings is active on Yukong when her ultimate is used, additionally increases all allies' crit rate by a percentage and crit damage also by a percentage. At the same time, deals imaginary damage equal to a percentage of Yukong's attack to a single enemy. 130 energy ultimate. Oof, she's gonna need some energy regeneration for sure with that above average energy cost. Planning ahead and speed tuning might be required so that you're able to utilize her ultimate to its full extent. After all, it wouldn't be very energy efficient if you had to use her skill before casting her ultimate for the additional effect. Lastly, since it states at the same time, at the bottom here, at the same time, basically like Silverwolf's ultimate, I believe the crit rate and crit damage buffs are applied before Yukong hits the enemy. So a nice damage boost to her ultimate as well. Alright, moving on to her talent. Basic attack additionally deals imaginary damage equal to a percentage of Yukong's attack, and increases the toughness reducing damage of this attack by 100%. This effect can be triggered again in 1 turn. Okay, so her talent also makes her a pretty solid single target imaginary breaker as well. Not bad. And finally for Yukong's technique. After using her technique, Yukong enters sprint mode for 20 seconds. In sprint mode, her movement speed is increased by 35%, and Yukong gains 2 stacks of Roaring Bowstrings when she enters battle by attacking enemies. It's a pretty fun technique to use in the overworld. It lets Yukong go really fast. However, keep in mind that the Roaring Bowstring stacks generated by her technique can be consumed by Yukong after she takes her turn. This is because the Roaring Bowstring stacks were not generated by her skill. Okay, now let's go over her major traces. Her first major trace, Yukong can resist 1 debuff application for 1 time. This effect can be triggered again in 2 turns. Basically a self-cleanse every 2 turns. Not bad. You definitely don't want your supports to be CC'd, so this major trace is for sure worth unlocking, especially since it's the first major trace. After all, the cost will be very low. For her second major trace, when Yukong is on the field, imaginary damage dealt by all allies increases by 12%. Similar to Asta's second major trace, except it's imaginary for Yukong. It's worth unlocking if you plan on making a mono imaginary team, or if you plan on using an imaginary main DPS. Maybe someone like Welt for now. Later on, Hoyoverse will most likely introduce more main DPS of the imaginary element. Otherwise, I believe this major trace is optional. Alright, now for the third and final major trace. When Roaring Bowstrings is active, Yukong regenerates 2 additional energy every time an ally takes action. Yes! This is what any Harmony character wants and needs. By the way, ultimates can trigger this. I tested it in her character trial earlier, so characters that can take multiple actions like Zile and Sushang make great partners with Yukong. An absolutely must-have major trace that completes Yukong's energy hungry kit. Alright, now let's go over her Eidolons. Starting off with her Eidolon 1. At the start of battle, increases the speed of all allies by 10% for 2 turns. A small 2-turn speed buff for all allies. Meh. Nothing amazing. It's nice to have, but not really worth spending your tickets to summon for. For her Eidolon 2, when an ally's current energy is equal to its energy limit, Yukong regenerates an additional 5 energy. This effect can only be triggered once for each ally. The trigger count is reset after Yukong casts her ultimate. Okay, now we're talking. Essentially, an extra 15 energy for Yukong. Even more if you run a energy regeneration link rope. This Eidolon definitely has some value and is probably worth pulling for. Her Eidolon 3 levels up her skill by 2 levels and her basic attack by 1 level. Extra damage overall for herself and her allies. Not bad, but also nothing special. On to her Eidolon 4. When Roaring Bowstrings is active, Yukong deals 30% more damage to enemies. Alright, even more damage apparently. I have a feeling that Yukong might function really well as a sub DPS as well, especially with these type of Eidolons. Next is her Eidolon 5, which gives both her ultimate and talent 2 additional levels. Yep, even more damage for herself and her allies. I guess her Eidolons really are worth pulling for, especially if you plan on building Yukong as a sub DPS, because even though it's just more damage, it's a lot of damage. And this additional damage will scale really well with the buffs that she provides, so it's definitely something worth considering. And finally, we get to her Eidolon 6. When Yukong uses her ultimate, she immediately gains 1 stack of Roaring Bowstrings. Oh, here we go! I was waiting for this type of Eidolon. This Eidolon basically fixes any issues Yukong has with her Roaring Bowstrings mechanic. Oh man, that is nasty, Hoyoverse. You put the most cracked Eidolon last. Well, good luck pulling 5 copies of Yukong for those of you who want this Eidolon. Alright, now let's finally talk about Luocha. His basic attack is also single target imaginary damage. As for his skill, however, after using his skill, Luocha immediately restores the target ally's HP equal to a percentage of Luocha's attack plus a flat amount. Meanwhile, Luocha gains 1 stack of Abyss Flower, which I will go over later in further detail. When any ally's HP percentage drops below 50% or lower, an effect equivalent to Luocha's skill will immediately be triggered and applied to this ally for 1 time, without consuming skill points. This effect can be triggered again after 2 turns. It's also worth mentioning that the emergency heal on this skill also gains a stack of Abyss Flower for Luocha. And because this emergency heal can be triggered every 2 turns, he's going to want some speed, so that this emergency heal can be active more often. This is an extremely powerful healing skill that basically makes Natasha and Bailu's healing skills pale in comparison. Alright, moving on to his ultimate. Removes 1 buff from all enemies, and deals imaginary damage equal to a percentage of Luocha's attack to all enemies. Luocha gains 1 stack of Abyss Flower. AOE Buff Removal is amazing to have, especially for the current enemies of Memory of Chaos. Trust me, it will make your life a lot easier. On top of that, the buff removal is not affected by effect resist, so there's no need to worry about building effect hit rate on Luocha. Lastly, with the low energy cost of 100, this means that his ultimate is going to be active more often than not, which in turn means more Abyss Flower stacks, and I'll explain the importance of this very shortly when I cover his talent. For his talent, when Abyss Flower reaches 2 stacks, Luocha consumes all stacks of Abyss Flower to deploy a field against the enemy. When any enemy in the field is attacked by an ally, the attacking ally's HP is immediately restored by an amount equal to a percentage of Luocha's attack plus a flat amount. The field's effect lasts for 2 turns. When Luocha is knocked down, the field will be dispelled. Wow! They buffed his talent from beta. It used to be 3 stacks for the flower field. Only needing 2 Abyss Flower stacks basically means that his Abyss Flower field will almost always be available. This in turn means that he will have more consistent heals for his allies, even without an instant emergency heal on his ultimate like Natasha and Bailu. And finally, for his technique, after the technique is used, the talent will be immediately triggered at the start of the next battle. Basically a free Abyss Flower field. Okay, now we move on to his major traces, starting off with his first major trace. When the skill's effect is triggered, removes 1 debuff from a target ally. Basically the same as Natasha's first major trace, a cleanse is always very useful to have. Unfortunately, this is one of the few significant features that Bailu lacks. If Bailu had a cleanse in her kit, she would literally be a near perfect healer. But this video is not about Bailu, so let's continue on with Luocha's major traces. For his second major trace, when any enemy in the field is attacked by an ally, all allies, except for the attacker, restore HP equal to 7% of Luocha's attack plus 93. Is Hoyoverse insane? Holy crap! This one major trace completely breaks Luocha. One of his main problems before release was the lack of team-wide heals, and now that issue is completely fixed with his second major trace. An absolutely insane second major trace that must be unlocked no matter the cost. And finally, for his third major trace, the chance to resist crowd control debuffs increases by 70%. Wow. All his major traces are just cracked. A healer that is resistant to crowd control is like a dream come true. Basically, in summary, all his major traces need to be unlocked. And as usual for these limited 5 stars and their Eidolons, I'm only gonna go over his first Eidolon. Because if you are concerned about anything past that, then just go ahead and pull him. No worries, you can probably afford it. For his Eidolon 1, while the field is active, attack of all allies increases by 20%. His Eidolon 1 is good. It essentially turns him into an offensive support, basically a Harmony character. Not really needed, however. I mean, you can literally just use a Harmony character if you wanted this type of buff. Because of this, I recommend free-to-play and small spenders not to pull for his Eidolon 1. Okay, next I'm gonna go over Luocha's pros and cons, starting off with the pros. For his first pro, he is of the rare imaginary element. Currently, we only have 2 other options when it comes to imaginary characters, and that would be Welt and Yukong. And the imaginary element is definitely one of the stronger defensive elements, able to control the tide of the battle. On top of that, Luocha actually has pretty decent break potential, because his ultimate can hit all enemies on the field. So if you want that imaginary coverage that you're lacking, which most people are, then Luocha's definitely got you covered. For the next pro, he is currently the strongest healer in the game. Granted, we only have 3 as of now. And a healer is currently the highest in-demand role at the moment, especially for those who are trying to clear the Memory of Chaos. The fact that he has an emergency heal without the use of skill points or energy already pushes Luocha above Bailu and Natasha. And because Hoyoverse thought it was a good idea to add an AOE team-wide heal on his second major trace whenever an ally hits an enemy, he now also provides team-wide heals for his team. So before his issue was he only had single target heals, well, that's no longer the case. He basically does almost everything. His next pro, he enables offensive teams. With how strong Luocha's heals are, you no longer need a defensive support or tank. Your team can basically consist of a DPS, offensive support, a debuffer, and Luocha obviously in the last slot. This basically allows players to clear the Memory of Chaos at a faster rate for more star rewards and additional Stellar Jade. For his next pro, which I find quite amusing as well, he is very difficult to crowd control because of his third major trace. When you pair that with some additional effect resist, either from his light cone or substats from his relics, he essentially becomes unstoppable and cannot be CC'd. That's basically every healer's dream. If your healer can't get CC'd or crowd controlled, then you'll always be able to heal, you'll always be able to cleanse your allies. There's absolutely no downside to that. And finally, for his last pro, he has an AOE Buff Removal that can be useful against certain enemies, especially the current Mara-struck enemies in the current season of Memory of Chaos. If you have Luocha, I guarantee you your life is going to be so much easier in the Memory of Chaos. Not to mention that having buff removal is always a nice utility to have on your team. This is why, for example, Pella, who is a rated 4-star on his banner, is also another really good character worth investing into. Alright, now we move on to his cons. Starting off with the first con. Luocha is less durable in comparison to your traditional healer that scales off HP. So when you compare him to someone like Bailu and Natasha, he's definitely going to be more frail in comparison. Which brings me to his next con. He's going to require investment in both offensive and defensive stats. He's going to need quite a bit of attack percent to scale his heals, and some speed in order for him to be a skill point generator, as well as reducing his emergency heal cooldown. And he's going to need a good mix of HP percent and defense percent in his relic substats in order to make him durable enough in order to survive. The last thing you need in a Memory of Chaos run is for your healer to get one-shotted. And finally, for his last con, which in my opinion there are ways around it, but I'm still going to list it, is Luocha's lack of an immediate team heal. Unlike Bailu and Natasha Ultimate, he can only heal one ally in the case of an emergency. So basically, he's not like Bailu and Natasha, who have a panic button, as I like to call it, when your team gets nuked or chunked down, that they can smash and top everyone off. Now, a good way around this issue is, if you save your ally's ultimate that deals damage after your team has taken damage, then you can use that ultimate to heal everyone on your team. So let's say, for instance, your team gets chunked down, Luocha's Abyss Flower Field is active, you have Zile's ultimate, for example. You can just cast Zile's ultimate to give your team a relatively strong team-wide heal. It won't be nearly as strong as Natasha or Bailu's ultimate, but it's something you can at least work with to keep your team alive. And if you have multiple ultimates that deal damage active, then you can heal your team for even more. So that's basically one way you can play around this issue that Luocha has. It's definitely going to require some planning ahead, and the gameplay is not as straightforward as compared to playing someone like Natasha or Bailu. Okay, now it's time to finally answer the question that everyone is asking. Should you pull or skip Luocha? I'm going to start off with the reasons why I recommend you guys to pull for Luocha. And the first reason why you should consider pulling for Luocha is if you don't have Bailu. Even if you have Japard, I'd still recommend pulling for Luocha, as I believe a healer is generally a safer investment than a shielder. On top of that, Luocha allows for more offensive gameplay in the Memory of Chaos, which in turn will allow you to gain better rewards when compared to someone like Japard. And for the next reason why you might want to consider pulling for Luocha is if you want Luocha himself and are interested in pulling any of the rate up 4-stars. For instance, if you don't have Pella yet, she's a really good debuffer, so I recommend pulling for her. If you want Eidolons for Qing Tre or Yukong, then it's definitely worth considering pulling on Luocha's banner. Next, you should consider pulling for Luocha if you plan on pulling for Blade as well in patch 1.2. He synergizes really well with Luocha's kit, due to Blade's playstyle involving him taking a lot of damage and dropping the low HP. And for the final reason why you should consider pulling for Luocha is very obvious. If you like the character, go ahead and pull him. Alright, now let's go over the reasons why you might want to consider skipping Luocha. And the first reason is if you already have Bailu, basically me. Currently, my Bailu and Natasha are already well invested into, so there really aren't any resources or the need to reinvest into a third healer, especially for free-to-play players. For this reason, I recommend skipping him. For the second reason why you might want to consider skipping Luocha is if the Memory of Chaos is not of interest to you. If you have absolutely no interest in clearing the Memory of Chaos as fast as you can, or with a certain amount of stars, then you definitely do not need Luocha. And for the last reason why you might want to skip Luocha's banner is if you are low on Stellar Jade and plan on saving for a future limited 5-star. Then obviously, don't let me ruin your plans. Skip Luocha, go for that future limited 5-star that you have been saving your Stellar Jades for. Alright guys, well that's gonna be it for this Honkai Star Rail video. Let me know in the comments below whether you guys plan on pulling or skipping Luocha. And if you guys found this video helpful and entertaining, please leave a like, subscribe, or join if you wish to support my channel even further. But other than that, I'll see you guys in the next Honkai Star Rail video. Peace!
Wanna spar? Disappear among the